Bears refuse to approach the shed. When the farmer sees why, he goes pale. The sun climbs slowly over the ridge, casting long shadows across Whispering Pines Farm, where dew clung to the grass like tiny jewels. John Harper stood at the edge of his porch, a coffee mug warming his calloused hands. At 60, his back ached more than it used to, but his senses were as sharp as ever. He listened, not just to the bird song or the rustling trees, but to the silence in between. Something in that silence felt wrong. The morning was unusually still, not the peaceful kind of still, but tense, like a held breath. He set his mug down and grabbed his coat. Whispering Pines Farm was more than just a retirement haven. It was a sanctuary. Over the past 2 decades, John had rescued owls with broken wings, deer hit by trucks, and once even a fox cub burned in a wildfire. But his most unusual residents were the ones he'd taken in 6 months ago. Ember, a full-grown black bear, and her 2 cubs, Blaze and Ash. He had found them on the edge of his property after a violent summer storm. The mother bear had deep cuts along her flank, and the cubs were shivering, their eyes glassy with shock. John could have called wildlife control. Instead, he opened the gate to an old fenced paddock and began the long, cautious work of gaining their trust. It hadn't been easy, but over time, he earned it. Ember never let him close enough to touch her, but she didn't growl anymore when he approached, and the cubs had grown used to his scent. They roamed the outer areas of the paddock freely now, foraging and climbing, playing like any wild creatures learning the world. But today, that fragile peace cracked. He first noticed it when he walked past the old storage shed near the north fence. Normally, the bears wandered close to the woods by this hour. Today, they were clustered around the shed. Ember stood directly in front of the door, her massive form rigid. Blaze and Ash huddled beside her, peeking out with anxious eyes. As John approached, Ember let out a low, warning growl. He stopped in his tracks. "Easy, girl," he said softly, hands open. She didn't move. Her eyes were locked onto him, unblinking, her breath steaming in the cool morning air. She shifted slightly to block more of the door with her body. It wasn't just protectiveness, it was territorial, defensive. John frowned. He stepped back slowly and whistled for Cody. Moments later, Cody Miller, tall and lanky with a mop of curly hair sticking out from under his cap, jogged up the path. "What's up?" John pointed. "They're guarding the shed. Never seen her like this." Cody tilted his head. "You think something's inside? Maybe. Or under." John stepped closer, crouching to examine the foundation. A faint chemical smell tickled his nose. Sharp, metallic, unnatural. Cody caught it too. "You smell that?" "Yeah," John muttered. "Get the pry bar." 10 minutes later, they were kneeling inside the shed, which hadn't been used for storage in years. Dust thick enough to write in coated the floorboards. With a few sharp cracks, Cody levered up a warped plank. The stench hit them instantly, weird and nauseating. Beneath the planks, hidden under layers of dirt, was a rusted metal trapdoor. John stared at it, heart pounding. "You ever seen this before?" Cody asked. John shook his head. "This place was built before I bought the farm. Maybe my dad knew, but it's not in any of the blueprints." Carefully, they opened the trapdoor. A narrow shaft descended into darkness, and a cool, damp draft rose to meet them. John flicked on a flashlight and slowly climbed down. The beam revealed a narrow tunnel with low ceilings and metal drums stacked against the walls. Some had burst open, leaking black sludge onto the packed earth floor. Cody joined him, mouth covered with his sleeve. "This is bad," he muttered. "Real bad." John moved closer to one drum and wiped off the grime. The faded letters HI were stenciled in red paint. Horizon Industries, a name he hadn't heard in years. The company had pulled out of Meadowview a decade ago after locals protested their plan to mine near the town's protected wetlands. They'd gone quiet, but clearly something had remained. "We need to get out of here," John said. Back in the daylight, John sat on the porch steps, the images burning in his mind. The drums, the smell, the secrecy. Ember stood near the fence line, watching him with eyes that held centuries of instinct. She had known. She had felt it, long before he did. That evening, John called Emily Carter, Meadowview's veterinarian. When she arrived, she examined Ember and the cubs carefully. "Physically, they're fine," she said, removing her gloves, "but their behavior makes sense. Animals pick up on environmental cues, chemical changes, vibrations. If there's something toxic underground, they'd know. John nodded slowly. There's something else. We found a tunnel, drums of waste, Horizon Industries. Emily's eyes narrowed. You should report this. Not yet. I want to understand what I'm dealing with. She didn't argue, but her expression said she thought otherwise. That night, sleep didn't come easily. John lay awake, the image of the drums and Ember's tense body etched into his thoughts. At one point, he rose and walked out to the edge of the field. The moon cast a silver glow over everything. Ember was there, sitting quietly, cubs curled beside her. He stepped closer, but she didn't move. He sat down a few yards away, the night air crisp in his lungs. You saved us, he whispered. Ember turned her head, eyes catching the moonlight, and for a moment he felt like he was being judged. Not by an animal, but by something older, something walled and sacred. The next morning, Cody arrived early with coffee and an old Meadowview topographic map. He unrolled it on the kitchen table. The shed sits right above an old creek bed, feeds into the stream that runs to the town reservoir. John traced the line with his finger. If that stuff is leaking, it could already be in the water. They exchanged a heavy look. This isn't just about us anymore. The day passed in quiet tension. John and Cody took more samples, sealed them in jars, and marked the location of each drum. They found a second tunnel branching off the first, newer and more carefully hidden. The same black sludge lined the floor. At sunset, John stood again at the shed, staring at the trapdoor. Ember paced nearby, her muscles tense. She wasn't just reacting. She was guarding, protecting, not just her cubs. Something deeper. The land, the farm, him. He thought of his wife Sarah again, her love of nature, her belief in listening to what the earth was trying to say. He could almost hear her voice in the rustling trees. John, don't turn away. He didn't. He stood beside the trap door until the stars came out, Ember at his side, both of them facing the darkness below. Not afraid, just ready. John stood at the trap door's edge for a long moment, the cold metal handle still imprinted on his palm from the night before. The flashlight beam quivered slightly in his grip as he descended the makeshift ladder into the darkness. The damp air below carried the same acrid tang, stronger now, saturating his nostrils and settling uneasily in his chest. Cody followed a few steps behind, more cautious, clutching a digital camera and a notepad. The tunnel, about 6 feet high and reinforced with old timber, stretched 50 feet into the earth. Along its damp walls, metal drums stood in neat rows, their surfaces eaten with rust, their contents seeping through cracks into the soil. John knelt beside one, brushing dirt from the faded logo. Horizon Industries, he muttered, the words sour on his tongue. Cody leaned in, snapping pictures of the labels, the leaks, and the trickling black sludge. These aren't just old waste, John said grimly. They're active. Someone's been dumping here recently. A fresh set of footprints in the point, shallow but defined, led deeper into the tunnel. They followed them until the passage ended in a newer section. Cleaner cuts in the timber, fresher boards. Someone had extended it not long ago. This isn't just a leftover mistake, Cody whispered. This is still happening. Above them, a faint tremor vibrated the soil and both men paused, holding their breath. Ember's distant growl echoed faintly through the ground like a warning from the earth itself. They didn't linger. Back above ground, John wasted no time. He placed a call to Emily Carter, not just a vet, but a friend he trusted. I need you to check on the bears, he told her. I think they've been exposed to something down here. She arrived within the hour, her battered green truck crunching up the gravel. As she checked Ember and the cubs, who remained unusually close to the shed, she frowned. They're alert, agitated. Not sick yet, but I'd bet they sense the contamination. Animals feel these things long before we do. John nodded and brought her to the trapdoor. Her face hardened as she peered into the dark. You need to be careful, she said. If this goes public, you're going to have enemies. Big ones. That same afternoon, as if summoned by some invisible signal, Meadowview's mayor, Michael Reynolds, pulled into the drive in his polished black SUV. Tall, smooth-talking, and dressed in a tailored jacket, far too clean for a farm visit, Reynolds stepped out with a practiced smile. John, he called, I heard through the grapevine you might be considering selling your water rights. John's brow furrowed. Not true, he replied flatly. That creek's been part of this farm for generations. Reynolds waved it off with a laugh. We've got development projects in motion. Parks, homes, maybe even a new rec center. The town's growing. We'd pay you well. I'm not interested. Think about it, Reynolds said, then paused, eyeing the shed. You've got a good thing here. It'd be a shame if regulations got in the way. With that, he left, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. That night, John didn't sleep. He sat by the window with his rifle on the table and a floodlight aimed at the shed. Around midnight, movement caught his eye. Two figures slipped past the tree line, crouching low, their steps silent. But before they could reach the trap door, a ferocious roar shattered the silence. Ember charged from the shadows, her massive form barreling toward the intruders. They fled in panic, stumbling over themselves, disappearing into the woods. Cody arrived moments later, panting. I saw them too. They were trying to cover their tracks. John looked at Ember, who now stood between him and the shed, breathing heavily, muscles tense. She's guarding it like her own den, Cody whispered. She knows this land better than we do. The next morning, John made another call. This one was harder. It had been years since he spoke to his son. Ryan, he said after the long silence was broken by a familiar but distant voice. It's Dad. I need your help. There was a pause. Is everything okay? Not really. There's something happening here. Chemicals. Maybe poisoning. You're an environmental chemist. I need your eyes on this. Hours passed before Ryan arrived from Denver, carrying testing kits and a guarded expression. The air between them was tense, brittle like frost-covered glass. They exchanged few words as Ryan began sampling soil, water, and the sludge from the drums. Industrial solvents, he confirmed, after running tests in John's old workshop. And heavy metals, lead, arsenic. If these are leaching into the groundwater, it's a serious threat. To Meadowview, to everything downriver. They followed the creek behind the shed, collecting water samples at intervals. Ryan frowned. Contaminated, even 10 yards downstream. John clenched his jaw, and Ember knew before we did. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, Ryan sat on the porch watching his daughter Mia's picture on his phone. She's 9 now, he said quietly. She'd love it here, but I couldn't risk bringing her until I knew it was safe. You could have come sooner, John replied, his voice rough. After Sarah passed, I know, Ryan said, not unkindly. We were all grieving, but I'm here now. Ember approached the porch slowly, her cubs hanging back. She didn't come close, but stood watching. Ryan looked at her and then at his father. She trusts you. She's got a reason to, John said. She saved us. That night, while the men reviewed evidence, Blaze and Ash began digging near the shed, pawing at the earth like hounds on a scent. John followed, kneeling beside the hole. Another wooden beam lay beneath the soil, fresher than the rest. With effort, they uncovered a secondary trapdoor, smaller, newer. Inside were more drums, these without labels but still seeping dark fluid. They're still dumping, Ryan growled. We need to go to the EPA, now. They'll try to stop us, John said. Reynolds already sent men once, Rashane. Let them come, we'll be ready. As they sealed the tunnel and copied all their data onto flash drives, Ember circled the perimeter, her form just visible in the moonlight. She wasn't just a bear anymore. She was a sentinel. The part ended with John packing the truck, placing the samples in a cooler. He looked to the woods where Ember stood like a shadow cast by the forest itself. Stay close, he whispered. This isn't over yet. And from the trees, Ember's low rumble answered, not as a threat, but as a vow. They were in this fight together now. Nature had sounded its alarm, and John Harper had finally listened. The morning broke with a heavy gray sky, the kind that seemed to press down on the land and dim even the brightest corners of Meadowview. John Harper stood in the barn with Ryan and Cody, their breath visible in the cold air as they reviewed the last of the printed photographs. Images of leaking drums, contaminated water samples, and soil analysis reports confirming what they all now knew to be true. Horizon Industries had been using Whispering Pines as an illegal dumping site for years, and the pollution was steadily spreading into the town's water system. We got enough evidence to blow this wide open, Ryan said, flipping through the lab results. But the moment we go public, we're targets. Cody nodded grimly. And Reynolds isn't going to sit quietly while his secrets come out. As if on cue, a black pickup rolled to a stop at the front gate. Two men in plain clothes stepped out, wearing jackets labeled State Water Commission. John's stomach turned. Let me guess, they didn't call ahead. He stepped out to meet them while Ryan turned on the audio recorder hidden in his vest. Good morning, one of the men said, smiling too easily. We're conducting a routine inspection of local water sources. Mind if we take a look at your property? Without a warrant? John asked. Just protocol, sir. We've had some complaints. From Mayor Reynolds, I bet, John muttered, arms crossed. You can look when you come back with paperwork. The men exchanged a glance, tension flickering in their eyes. Suit yourself, one said. Just remember, non-compliance has consequences. They got back into their truck and drove off, kicking up gravel. Back inside the barn, John exhaled slowly. That was a warning. Ryan pulled out his phone. I'm sending the report to my contact at the EPA. If we wait too long, they'll bury this. While Ryan uploaded the data, Emily Carter arrived in her truck, her face taut with urgency. I just came from the Parker Ranch, she said. 2 of their goats are sick, blisters, liver inflammation, same symptoms I saw in that fox last week. This is spreading, John. Cody looked alarmed. That creek cuts across half the property south of town. Emily nodded. And I've got parents asking why their kids are getting strange rashes after drinking tap water. People are starting to notice. Then we need to make it impossible to ignore, Ryan said. Public pressure can force the EPA to act faster. John looked toward the shed, where Ember and the cubs sat like statues. We've already seen what happens when we wait. That night, the pressure reached a breaking point. The floodlight near the shed flickered and died, casting the entire area into shadow. Cody, making his rounds, spotted 2 silhouettes near the tunnel entrance. He whistled and Ember roared in response, tearing through the underbrush toward the intruders. Chaos erupted. Flashlights dropped. Footsteps pounded the ground as 2 men scrambled to escape, one of them tripping over a root and shrieking as he barely avoided Ember's swiping paw. The roar sent birds scattering from the trees. John fired a warning shot into the air, and silence returned, thick and uneasy. They're not just trying to scare us anymore, Ryan said. They're trying to destroy evidence. John stared into the darkness. And they almost did. The next morning, Meadowview awoke to a front-page headline in the local paper. Wildlife vet warns of toxic water risk. Emily had gone public, risking her career. The article detailed the symptoms in local animals, hinted at human illnesses, and quoted her warning that contamination from unknown sources could soon become a health emergency. The story caused a stir. Neighbors began calling John, some curious, some frightened. Mary Ellis, a longtime friend and fellow farmer, arrived that afternoon. Tell me it isn't true, she said, her voice shaking. It is, John replied. We've got proof, but we need the town behind us. Mary's eyes hardened. Then you've got me, and I'll bring others. That evening, a group of townspeople gathered at John's barn. Around a heater, they passed photos, test results, and maps. Ryan explained the chemistry in layman's terms, while John told them what he'd seen and what the bears had sensed long before any human could. You're telling me that bear saved your farm? A rancher asked. John nodded. She's more than a bear. She's part of this land, and she's trying to protect it. By the time the meeting ended, 20 people had pledged to support the investigation. Mary agreed to start a petition. Cody set up a secure website with the evidence archive. But Reynolds wasn't finished. That night, Horizon Industries released a statement claiming an accidental chemical spill occurred at one of their older facilities and had already been contained. They denied any illegal dumping, called John's claims misguided speculation, and implied that anyone spreading rumors could face defamation lawsuits. The next morning, a checkpoint appeared on the only road leading out of Whispering Pines. Sheriff William Parker, once a neutral presence in town, now stood at the roadblock. He stopped John's truck as he and Ryan tried to leave for Helena to deliver the physical evidence. Sorry, John, Parker said. Temporary inspection zone, environmental safety protocol. This is nonsense and you know it, John said. I've got a right to leave my own land. Orders from the mayor, Parker said quietly. You're a good man, John. Don't make me arrest you. Forced to turn back, John fumed. They're trying to stall us long enough to clean the tunnels. Ryan clenched the steering wheel. Then we don't use the road. That night, with Cody's help and a map from Mary, they loaded the samples into Cody's ATV and took the old firebreak trail through the hills. Mud sprayed in all directions, but they made it past the checkpoint and onto Route 12, where they transferred the evidence to Emily's waiting vehicle. She sped toward Helena while John and Cody returned to the farm. At the shed, the bears were gone. Panic set in. Had someone taken them? But then from the distant tree line, Ember emerged, flanked by Blaze and Ash, all of them tense and alert. They had gone searching. As John stepped forward, Ember let out a deep growl and padded toward the shed, nose to the ground. She sniffed near the foundation, then started digging furiously. Within minutes, her claws hit something hard, another trapdoor. They had another tunnel, Cody whispered. Even more waste. Ryan joined them, flashlight in hand. The new tunnel was narrower, more recent, and packed with unlabeled barrels, some still warm. They were going to move these, Ryan said, tonight. They were going to erase the last piece, John muttered, but Ember stopped them again. The EPA arrived 2 days later, led by an agent named Dana Ruiz. Emily's documentation and the community's support had pushed the case to the top of the priority list. The agents sealed the property, tested the barrels, and confirmed everything John and Ryan had found. You did the right thing, Ruiz told John, and you did it in time. As they watched the hazmat teams descend into the tunnels, John felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow. The fight wasn't over, but the tide had turned. That night, Ember returned to her favorite spot near the woods, lying down with a heavy sigh. John brought her apples, as he had from the beginning, and placed them on the grass. She didn't approach, just watched with steady eyes. You kept us safe, he said. All of us. She blinked slowly, then looked toward the darkened trees as if sensing something still hidden. The wind shifted. In it, John thought he heard another warning. But he wasn't afraid. He had his family back. He had his community, and he had nature itself watching his back. Spring arrived like a long-awaited breath in Meadowview, washing away the last traces of snow and fear alike. The air smelled of thawing soil and pine sap, and the creek that once carried poisoned water now gurgled clear and cold under the watchful eye of federal monitors. John Harper stood on the porch of Whispering Pines Farm, a steaming mug of tea in hand, and watched as children ran laughing between the pens of rescued animals. The place no longer felt like a quiet refuge on the edge of the world. It felt alive, transformed into something greater. Ember's Haven, the new wildlife sanctuary, had officially opened its gates. Named after the bear who had first sensed the danger, the sanctuary had become both symbol and solution, dedicated not only to healing animals, but to educating the community about stewardship, conservation, and the lessons nature tried to teach when humans stopped long enough to listen. But getting here had not been simple. After the EPA's full investigation confirmed the illegal dumping, headlines swept the state. Mayor Reynolds implicated in hazardous waste cover-up. Hidden contracts and internal emails traced the chain of guilt directly to him and several Horizon Industries executives. Arrests followed swiftly. Reynolds, stripped of his office and influence, sat behind bars awaiting trial. Horizon Industries was hit with one of the largest environmental fines in Montana's history. Their seized assets helped fund medical screenings, property remediation, and a town-wide water system overhaul. Residents received compensation, and new environmental protections were drafted with oversight from the very people who had once been ignored. And yet, for John, the real victory had little to do with headlines or courtrooms. It was in the quiet moment when his estranged son, Ryan, stood beside him after the chaos, arms around his wife, Lisa, and their daughter, Mia, who now called Meadowview home. It was in the friendship with Emily, who became the sanctuary's lead wildlife specialist. It was in Cody, who declined a university offer to help manage Ember's Haven, saying, "There's more to learn here than any classroom." The land had healed, and so had he. Still, the past had a way of whispering its reminders. It came one morning as John walked Maya along the edge of the old shed, the place where everything had begun. The building had been restored and turned into a learning center, with displays about pollution, water cycles, and animal instinct. But the soil there had always made John uneasy, even after remediation. Mia stopped and pointed. "Grandpa, why is that patch different?" The ground she gestured toward, just beside the shed's corner, was darker, sunken slightly. John knelt and sifted the earth between his fingers. It felt colder than it should. That afternoon, he returned with Cody and a soil probe. The reading spiked. Traces of contamination still remained. "We missed a drum," Cody said, "or maybe one got buried deeper than the rest." They marked the spot and called the EPA. Within a day, a team arrived with equipment, and digging began. Ember, now larger and more powerful than ever, wandered from the tree line as if drawn by the same instinct that had first saved them. She growled low and steady, pacing near the site as the earth was peeled back layer by layer. Then, metal. A rusted barrel nearly collapsed from pressure, oozed a thin stream of black sludge. The EPA quickly neutralized the area, hauling the drum away for analysis. "Another few months," Agent Ruiz said, "and this would have ruptured completely. Could have poisoned the new creek line." John turned to Ember. "You felt it. Again." She looked at him, her breath fogging gently in the cool breeze, then turned and vanished into the woods. Word of the discovery spread, and with it, Ember's legend grew. Children who once feared bears now carried sketches of Ember in their backpacks. One mural in the sanctuary's welcome center depicted her standing tall over the trapdoor, eyes blazing, cubs at her side. Mia called her Meadowview's hero. John couldn't argue. When the day of the sanctuary's grand ceremony arrived, the entire town gathered. John stood at the podium in front of the restored barn, flanked by Ryan, Lisa, Emily, and Cody. Banners hung from the rafters, the words "From Harm to Haven" emblazoned beneath a painted silhouette of a bear. Mary Ellis led the choir of local school children in a song about the seasons and survival, and when it ended, Mia stepped forward to share her story. She spoke of the first time she saw Ember, of the way her grandpa listened to the wind in the trees, and how animals sometimes knew the truth long before people did. Her voice trembled at first, but grew stronger as she read from her notebook. "This land is not just where we live, it's who we are. And when we protect it, it protects us." The crowd rose in applause, not just for the words, but for what they had become. A community reborn through truth, pain, and perseverance. Later, after the sun had dipped behind the western pines and the celebration wound down, John walked the perimeter alone. The sky was deep purple, and the stars blinked slowly into view. From the edge of the woods, a shape emerged. Ember. She came no closer, just stood there, golden eyes reflecting starlight. Behind her, Blaze and Ash lingered, taller now, nearly full-grown, but still unmistakably her cubs. John raised a hand in greeting. "We wouldn't have made it without you," he said quietly. "You reminded us of something we forgot. How to see, how to feel, how to fight for what matters." Ember blinked once, slowly, then turned and slipped back into the trees, her shadow melting into the forest. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The sanctuary she helped build would carry her memory. In every rescued hawk, every healed fox, every whisper of wind through pine needles, her presence would linger like a promise. Whispering Pines had once hidden a deadly secret. Now it hummed with life and hope, a place where man and beast no longer stood apart. And in that sacred balance, John Harper finally found peace. Circus Bear locked in darkness since 1 week old. His reaction to light brought everyone to tears. The wind howled across the outskirts of Aspen Ridge, Montana, tugging at the rusted sheet metal of an abandoned facility long since surrendered to time and silence. Sheriff Tom Carter stepped out of his cruiser, the gravel crunching beneath his boots. The February chill bit at his skin through the collar of his coat. But it wasn't the cold that tightened his jaw. It was the anonymous call that had come in that morning. Ring. No name, no details, just a weary voice whispering, "There's something alive out at the old circus storehouse, something that shouldn't be." Deputy Jake Reynolds trailed behind, younger, green, but eager, his flashlight already cutting through the dim afternoon light. The warehouse loomed before them, its structure slumping under years of snow, neglect, and rot. Peeling paint flaked from the doors, and vines choked the frame as if nature had tried to strangle the past but couldn't quite finish the job. Carter pushed the door open, its hinges shrieking in protest. A rush of air, stale and heavy with rust, mildew, and something worse, something living, but broken, poured out. The beam of their light swept across sagging tarps, warped wooden crates, and the skeletal remains of old circus equipment. Iron bars of forgotten animal cages caught the light like teeth. "This place gives me the creeps," Jake muttered. Carter didn't respond. He had heard something, a faint scrape, too deliberate to be wind, too soft to be machinery. "This way," he said, voice low, drawn toward the far corner of the building. There, behind a collapsed stand draped in tattered red velvet, they found it. A cage. No, a cell. Bare concrete on all sides, windowless, door chained shut with 3 rusted padlocks. Inside, huddled in the shadows, was a bear. Young, perhaps 4 years old, though the exact age was hard to guess. His fur, black but dull, hung in clumps from his gaunt frame. He was all bones and silence, motionless but for the slow rise and fall of his chest. Carter's heart sank. "Jesus," he murmured. Jake took a step back. "You think he's feral?" "I think he's forgotten what he is," Carter replied. He knelt slowly, careful not to startle the animal. The bear didn't move, didn't growl, just stared, unblinking. But when the door was opened slightly and the first sliver of pale winter light cut through the dim, something changed, not in his body, his muscles were too weak for that, but in his eyes. A flicker, a quiver of light behind the darkness, a remembering. Within hours, Dr. Emily Hayes had arrived. Her parka bore the town's small veterinary patch, but her presence felt larger than any uniform. She moved quietly, steadily, as if understanding that even footsteps carried weight in a place like this. She didn't speak at first. She crouched by the edge of the cage, observing. "How long?" she asked eventually. "Years," Carter said. "Maybe since he was born." Emily nodded, not surprised, just saddened. "We'll call him Shadow," she said, "because that's what he's lived in." It was then that Jack Morrison stepped into the building, his silhouette framed by the doorway like a memory returning. Jack had once been a wildlife specialist, revered across the state for his work with traumatized animals. But that was before the fire, before the accident that claimed a volunteer's life and shattered something in Jack that no amount of therapy had been able to repair. He hadn't stepped foot in a sanctuary in over 3 years. When Carter called, he almost didn't answer. But something in the man's voice, strained, urgent, honest, made him come. Now, standing before the cage, Jack saw the bear's eyes and knew why he was here. He didn't say a word, just knelt like Carter had, letting the silence settle between them. Shadow didn't flinch. He didn't move. But he watched. He saw Jack. The transport to Wild Haven Sanctuary was quiet. Shadow didn't resist when the transfer cage was wheeled in. He didn't roar, didn't pace. He simply walked in when coaxed, his steps so slow and deliberate it was like watching grief take shape. Ed Parker, founder of Wild Haven, was waiting with his arms crossed, his grizzled face unreadable. "You sure about this, Jack?" he asked. "I'm not sure of anything," Jack replied, "but he deserves a chance." "They all do," Ed said, then opened the gate. The sanctuary was tucked between mountain ridges where pine and aspen groves met vast skies. It was a place for healing, for wolves, foxes, owls with broken wings, and now for Shadow. They placed him in an enclosed indoor den at first, padded with straw, its walls reinforced but warm. Emily began with medical treatment, rehydration, vitamins, small meals. But it was Jack who stayed, hour after hour, just sitting on the other side of the mesh wall. He didn't speak, not much. He read sometimes. Mostly he just breathed in rhythm with Shadow. He knew that animals like this didn't need rescue, they needed remembering. They needed to believe that the world could still offer softness. Light came next, not overhead bulbs, but low red lamps that mimicked the dusk. Shadow flinched at first, recoiling to the farthest corner, but eventually he turned his head. Then one day Jack saw him blink into the glow and not retreat. He noted the moment. "Day 1, he whispered. He looked at the light. Kyle, Jack's 17-year-old son, started visiting the sanctuary after school. Their relationship had been brittle since the fire. Kyle blamed Jack for quitting, for shutting down, for leaving a part of himself behind. But as he watched his father lean gently toward the broken bear, Kyle saw something he hadn't in years. He brought his guitar, played soft chords from the other side of the wall. Shadow listened, not moved, but listened. Mia, Emily's daughter, brought apple slices, extending her hand until Shadow sniffed at it, lips barely parting. No snarling, just curiosity. Spring crept over the sanctuary in thawing bursts, and one morning the den door was open. Jack sat 10 feet away, knees in the grass, arms resting across his thighs. Shadow stepped forward. Slowly one paw, then another. The grass met his feet. He paused, sniffed, looked up. The sky above was vast, blue as breath. Shadow stared. He took a full step onto the earth. A low chuff rumbled from his chest. A sound of uncertainty, yes, but not of fear. Jack smiled. "Welcome home," he whispered. And in that fragile moment, beneath the Montana sky, the journey began, not just for a bear pulled from the shadows, but for a man who had almost forgotten that even the deepest wounds could heal in the light. The snow had melted into muddy paths at Wild Haven Sanctuary, leaving the scent of pine and thawed earth in its wake. Spring had come early to Aspen Ridge, and with it, a cautious hope that clung to the sanctuary like mist to the mountains. Shadow, the once forgotten bear, was beginning to move. Not just physically, though his gait had strengthened and his shoulders no longer sagged with each step, but emotionally, in the small but profound ways animals do when they begin to believe again. Jack watched him closely each day, from the moment the sun spilled through the eastern hills to when it dipped behind the evergreens. He didn't prod or force. He observed. Measured progress not in feet walked, but in how long Shadow stood in the sunlight before retreating. How often he turned his head toward a human voice instead of away. And Shadow, in turn, began to respond. He sniffed at the wind when Kyle played his guitar, nudged open a door when Mia brought apple slices, and once, when Jack sat reading aloud from an old book about wild bears, Shadow let out a low, almost contemplative chuff, as if remembering what it meant to listen. Yet even in the hush of healing, storms gather quietly. Travis Holt had heard the whispers. A bear had been found in one of the old circus cages. Not just any bear, but a male born to Luna, his last remaining breeding female before the bankruptcy. He had never registered the birth, never filed the paperwork. Why would he? The cub wasn't meant to survive. But now the news was everywhere. The town paper had run a small story, "Forgotten Bear Finds Hope at Local Sanctuary." A photo of Shadow standing in a shaft of sunlight, his thin body still recovering, but unmistakably regal, caught Travis's attention like a hook to the jaw. The bear was worth money, not for shows anymore. Those days were over, but in licensing, exotic ownership contracts, and publicity. So Travis made a call. Vanessa Grant, his longtime lawyer and fixer, answered after 2 rings. Her voice was sharp, deliberate. "You want to claim him?" "He's mine," Travis said. "Always was." "Then we file for property reclamation." She hesitated. "But it won't be easy. Animal rights groups are circling this story. The sanctuary's got public sympathy. I don't care. That bear is mine. Make it happen." The notice came a week later. Ed Parker unfolded the letter slowly, his thick fingers trembling with restrained fury. He read it aloud to Jack and Emily in the small log cabin that served as the sanctuary's office. "Mr. Holt seeks the immediate return of one male black bear, unnamed, born on or about 4 years ago to property owned by Holt Enterprises." Emily paled. "He has no right. He left that bear to rot." Jack didn't say a word. He simply stood and walked to the window, looking out at Shadow's enclosure. The bear was sprawled beneath a cluster of trees, his head resting on a rock, eyes half closed. Jack could see it clearly now. Peace, a fragile new peace that had taken months to grow. And in a courtroom, that peace might mean nothing. "We fight it," he said finally. "I'll call Rebecca Lane." Rebecca was the best litigator north of Billings, sharp, relentless, and powered by a lifelong belief that justice should have a spine. When she heard the story, she didn't hesitate. "I'll take the case pro bono," she said. "But be warned, he'll try to twist the narrative. Say Shadow's rehabilitation is kidnapping, that you're exploiting him for attention." Jack exhaled. "He's wrong, but Shadow can't speak for himself." "Then we speak for him," Rebecca said. "And we make damn sure the court listens." News spread fast. Reporters showed up at the sanctuary gates, cameras glinting in the sun, asking if they could film the miracle bear. Jack turned most of them away. He didn't want Shadow's trauma reduced to a headline, but some attention was necessary. Rebecca knew the value of public pressure, and with Emily's help, she orchestrated a quiet media push. Photos showing Shadow's early condition, clips of him learning to eat from a bowl, a video of him stepping into sunlight for the first time. The town of Aspen Ridge rallied around him. Locals brought donations, handmade signs that read, "Shadow belongs here," and even school children wrote letters pleading for the bear's safety. Jack felt the tide shifting, but Travis wasn't done. He hired two experts of his own, one a zoologist who claimed Shadow's long-term exposure to humans made him unfit for sanctuary life. The other a former animal trainer who insisted the bear's behavior was reclaimable for controlled environments. The hearing took place in late April. The courtroom was small, filled with murmured tension and the occasional whir of reporters' cameras. Jack sat at the front beside Rebecca, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. Emily sat behind them, a comforting presence, while Kyle and Mia kept Shadow's photo framed in their hands like a talisman. Travis entered in a pressed suit, eyes cold, smirking at the crowd. Rebecca rose first. Her voice, firm and measured, laid out the facts. Shadow had been kept in an unlit concrete cell for 4 years. His mother had died shortly after giving birth, and he was never registered or vaccinated. Travis had knowingly abandoned him in a structure without food or sunlight. She introduced Dr. Andrew Phillips, a wildlife behaviorist who testified that Shadow's trauma mirrored that of war prisoners: sensory deprivation, stunted development, psychological scars. Then came Dr. Christine Wu, a zoological rehabilitation specialist. She showed videos of Shadow's progress, noting how he responded to gentle human presence, how his physical health had returned, how moving him would trigger regression and likely death. "This is not a possession," she said, voice ringing clear. "This is a living being who has finally begun to heal. Returning him would be tantamount to abuse." Travis took the stand. He claimed Shadow was circus property, bred from licensed animals. Vanessa backed him up with papers, most forged, some incomplete. She argued that by nursing him to health, the sanctuary had increased his value, which technically still belonged to her client. Rebecca stood. "You're asking this court to ignore cruelty, suffering, and abandonment for the sake of profit. You speak of value? Shadow's value lies in his life, not in his market price." The judge listened. He asked questions, many. Then he asked to see the videos again. He watched Shadow's first step into sunlight 3 times. When the gavel finally came down, the words felt like wind breaking through storm clouds. "Shadow will remain in the care of Wild Haven Sanctuary. Mr. Holt's claims are denied, and charges of animal cruelty will be referred to the district attorney's office." The courtroom erupted in hushed cheers, tears, and stunned silence. Jack sat still, blinking back the flood that rose in his throat. He turned toward Rebecca, who smiled gently, then toward Emily, whose eyes shimmered. "We did it," she whispered. Back at the sanctuary that evening, Jack walked to Shadow's enclosure. The bear met him at the edge, standing tall, his coat now fuller, his eyes clearer. Jack chuffed softly. Shadow chuffed back. For the first time in a long while, Jack let the moment settle in his chest. Not victory, not relief, but purpose, returning like the warmth of spring after a cruel winter. And as the stars crept into the Montana sky, wide and endless, Shadow settled in the grass with his face turned upward. Free at last and home for good. The days that followed the courtroom victory were filled with a quiet kind of joy, the kind that grows slow and steady, like the spring grass pushing up through thawed earth. At Wild Haven, the mood shifted. It was as if the sanctuary itself exhaled, as though the towering pines and roaming breezes understood that something sacred had been protected. Shadow, now officially and legally under the care of Wild Haven, seemed to feel it too. His steps carried more weight, not the burdened heaviness of captivity, but the grounded confidence of a creature reclaiming himself. He no longer flinched when visitors walked by the edge of his enclosure. He would raise his head when Jack's voice rang out across the grounds. And sometimes, if he was in the mood, he'd even approach the low fence to sniff the air where Kyle and Mia stood waiting with fruit or honey on their palms. Jack noticed every change. He had begun documenting Shadow's progress again, this time not for legal defense, but as part of something bigger. Something he hadn't spoken aloud until one soft evening when he and Emily stood near the observation deck, the sky behind them blushing with sunset. "I'm thinking of opening a new center," he said quietly. "Not just for bears, for any wildlife that needs recovery, true recovery, Not cages, not exhibits. A place like this, but more focused, more mobile even. We could go to where they are, build temporary shelters, respond in real time. Emily turned, her face lit by the soft amber light. You mean like a wildlife recovery unit? He nodded. Morrison Wildlife Recovery. I can't stop thinking about making sure what happened to Shadow never happens again. Emily studied him for a long moment, then reached out and placed her hand over his. Then let's build it. Shadow's transformation deepened in the weeks that followed. What had once been a fragile animal who cowered from light now climbed the fallen logs in his habitat, swiping playfully at tree stumps and rolling onto his back to nap in warm patches of sunlight. Jack, Kyle, Mia, and Emily often sat nearby, watching silently, each of them aware that they were witnessing something rare, the moment when healing overtakes history. But healing wasn't only happening inside the bear's enclosure. For Jack, every day beside Shadow chipped away at the hard, jagged grief he had carried for years. The death of his colleague had left him hollow, ashamed, convinced he wasn't fit to care for any living thing again. But then came this bear, abandoned, broken, silent, and the quiet challenge of his existence had whispered to something deep in Jack's soul. In Shadow's resilience, Jack saw his own. In the bear's slow return to the world, Jack found the map back to himself. And perhaps the most unexpected part of all was Kyle. At first, the boy had hovered at the edges, not quite distant, but not fully present either. Their bond had thinned over the years into something polite but strained. Yet it was in Shadow's world that they began to meet again. Kyle, with his guitar and quick smile, slowly became one of the bear's favorite visitors. Shadow would lumber closer when he heard the soft strumming, sometimes sitting down just a few feet away as though listening. One day, Jack found Kyle seated cross-legged in the grass near the fence, Shadow resting on the other side like a mirror. Jack didn't say anything. He just watched. And when Kyle looked up and grinned, Jack grinned back. Later that night, as they cleaned out an old storage shed for Jack's upcoming recovery unit project, Kyle cleared his throat. I'm proud of you, Dad. Jack froze, a wrench in one hand. For what, he asked. For not giving up. On Shadow. On yourself. On me. Whoosh, Jack set the tool down, his throat tightening. I never stopped caring about you, Kyle. I know, Kyle said. I just didn't know how to say it back for a while. They didn't hug, not right then. But when they walked back to the house, they walked side by side, and that was enough. Wildhaven decided to hold a small event to honor Shadow's one-year rescue anniversary. It wasn't a flashy celebration, no banners or music, no media blitz, just the people who mattered. Sheriff Carter came, the lines on his face a little softer. Rebecca Lane attended, her eyes bright with quiet pride. Local kids painted wooden signs with messages like "Thank you, Shadow," and "You're safe now." There were educational booths about animal rights and sanctuary work, most of them organized by Mia and Kyle, who had grown into passionate advocates over the past year. Mia led a demonstration, standing outside Shadow's enclosure and showing how he now responded to familiar voices and gestures. When she called softly, Shadow ambled over, calm and curious, his massive head swaying as he sniffed the air. He doesn't perform, she told the crowd. He participates, because he's not afraid anymore. Jack stood in the background, arms crossed, his heart full. Emily slipped beside him, her fingers brushing his. Look what you started, she whispered. Jack shook his head. We all started it. Shadow just reminded us why it matters. As evening fell and the last guests trickled out, Jack stayed behind. He sat on the grass outside Shadow's enclosure, watching as the bear settled into his favorite spot beneath a pine tree. The light turned golden, the kind that made the world feel suspended. Jack leaned back on his hands, breathing in the pine-scented air. You did good, buddy, he said softly. You came through the dark. Shadow raised his head slightly, blinking at Jack before resting it back on his paws. There was no fear in him now, no flinch, no tremble, just quiet strength and peace. Jack reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. The rough sketch of the Morrison Wildlife Recovery logo was scribbled on the front. A bear stepping into sunlight, mountains in the background. This is for you, he murmured, and for every soul still waiting in the dark. The stars came out one by one, scattered across the Montana sky like lanterns, and in that sacred silence, a man and a bear sat together, two survivors whose scars had turned into stories, whose pain had become purpose, and whose bond would carry forward into every life they touched. Summer crept over Aspen Ridge with the ease of a whispered promise, coaxing green from every limb and painting the fields in swaying gold. At Wild Haven Sanctuary, life moved in a rhythm shaped by recovery and routine. The animals stirred with the dawn, the birds in their song-filled chorus, the foxes stretching in their dens, and Shadow, the heart of it all, lumbering out into the open with slow, confident steps that bore none of the fear that had once chained his body. A year had passed since the doors to his dark prison had opened, since light first touched his eyes and stirred something forgotten in his chest. Now his sleek black coat caught the sun like ink in motion, his frame powerful, his movement assured. He was no longer the echo of a creature. He was whole, and he belonged to no one but himself. Jack stood at the edge of the enclosure most mornings, coffee in hand, watching Shadow with a kind of reverence that words couldn't contain. There were days he still woke before the sun, haunted by old memories, flashes of the fire, the scream, the smoke, but they no longer swallowed him. They visited like passing shadows, acknowledged but no longer feared. He had learned to breathe through them, to live beyond them, just as Shadow had learned to live outside the cage. Morrison Wildlife Recovery had become more than an idea. It was real now. With the help of Emily, Kyle, and a network of former colleagues and sanctuary experts, Jack had secured funding, converted a retired animal transport rig into a mobile rehab unit, and begun the quiet work of reaching animals in forgotten corners of the state. Each rescue was hard, every story heavy, but every time they brought an animal to safety, he felt a weight lift, not just from the creature's shoulders, but from his own. Kyle had stepped up in ways Jack hadn't expected. His bond with Shadow had transformed into something deep and instinctive. When Kyle walked the fence line and Shadow followed, and the synchronicity was effortless. Kyle had taken over much of the sanctuary's education programming, speaking to schools, organizing youth outreach events, and even mentoring younger volunteers. Where once there had been tension and distance, now there was laughter. Meals shared around the kitchen table. The occasional disagreement, yes, but handled with the patience of two people learning to meet each other where they were. Jack had stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop. Sometimes love returned not as a roar, but as a steady presence that simply didn't leave. Mia, too, had found her stride. Inspired by the case and the role she played in Shadow's healing, she had launched a community group focused on wildlife awareness. Local kids spent weekends at the sanctuary under her guidance, learning how to track prints, identify animal calls, and speak with compassion. Her quiet courage had become a foundation others leaned on. Emily watched it all with a kind of proud tenderness that softened her usually analytical demeanor. Her days were still full, vaccines, surgeries, rescues, but she made space for this, for them, for a new chapter that was no longer shadowed by what if, but shaped by what now. By late August, the town of Aspen Ridge had changed too. Inspired by the publicity surrounding Shadow's legal battle, local ordinances had been rewritten. Animal cruelty penalties were stricter. Sanctuaries were better funded. A new hotline had been established for reporting abuse or neglect, and it was actively used. What began as a rescue had become a ripple, and that ripple had grown into a current. When Jack hosted a community open house to celebrate the launch of Morrison Wildlife Recovery's mobile unit, people came in droves. Farmers, students, retired circus workers, families who had once felt powerless now stood side by side. They toured the new rig, listened to talks about wildlife rehabilitation, and left with pamphlets in hand and purpose in their hearts. Shadow, though not part of the public event, was present in every conversation. His story had become legend, a tale not of a miracle, but of the steady, hard-earned triumph of empathy over neglect. That evening, after the last visitor had gone, Jack wandered back to Shadow's enclosure. The bear was lying near the pond, his chin resting on a smooth rock, eyes half closed in contentment. Jack leaned on the fence. "You did this," he said softly. "You reminded us what's worth fighting for." And as the days rolled toward autumn, Shadow's world expanded again. A few months after the celebration, Wildhaven took in 2 orphan cubs, a brother and sister pair found starving near a construction site. They were scared, aggressive at first, all snarls and swipes, but as they healed, they grew curious. And then the day came when the gate between their enclosure and shadows was eased open, a gradual introduction planned over weeks of parallel exposure. Jack, Emily, and Ed watched with held breath as Shadow approached them slowly, towering but gentle, emitting soft chuffs and low huffs of reassurance. The cubs hesitated, then one chuffed back. And just like that, a new family began. Shadow took to the cubs with a surprising tenderness. He didn't hover or dominate. He watched from a distance, intervened only when they grew too reckless, nudged them away from danger, shared space beneath the pines. It was as if he understood them in a way no human could. That shared history of loss, that instinctive need for safety. Visitors who watched the trio often left in tears, because this was more than survival. It was love, in the rawest, most honest sense. It was choosing presence, choosing patience, again and again. Winter came in with soft, white breath and long violet shadows. The sanctuary prepared as it always did, storing food, reinforcing structures, thickening the bedding in every den. Shadow had taken to sleeping in the den closest to the trees, the cubs curling near him like stars drawn to a planet's orbit. Jack watched them one evening as snow began to fall, his hands in his pockets, a quiet awe in his heart. Emily stepped beside him, wrapping her scarf tighter. "They're safe," she said, "and they're home." Jack nodded, his breath fogging in the cold. It's all I ever wanted, for him to know he mattered, that he wasn't just a thing forgotten. Emily leaned her head on his shoulder. "You've done more than that. You gave him his world back." On the anniversary of Shadow's rescue, they didn't host an event. They simply gathered, Jack, Emily, Kay, Mia, Ed, Sheriff Carter, Rebecca Lane, and sat together around a fire pit near the enclosure. They shared stories, laughed, passed hot cider around. Mia read a poem she'd written. Kyle played a quiet song on his guitar. At one point, Shadow emerged from the trees, watching them from the rise. He didn't come close, but he sat, still and present, the falling snow catching in his fur like dusted silver. And Jack, looking up at him, felt something inside him settle into place. Not closure, because healing didn't end, but peace. The kind that came from knowing you had faced the dark and walked out into the light, that you had reached back for another and pulled them through with you. As the fire crackled and the stars blinked awake overhead, Jack stood and walked to the fence. "You're not a symbol," he said, voice low. "You're not a story. You're Shadow. And you're free." Shadow chuffed once, then turned and vanished into the trees, his shape swallowed by the hush of winter. But even after he was gone, the warmth lingered, and it would remain, in the hearts of the people who had fought for him, in the lives that would be changed by what he'd endured and overcome, in the mountains that now held his wild spirit. The cage was gone, the past no longer a chain. And above it all, the Montana sky stretched vast and bright and endless, waiting to carry them all into the light beyond. Spring returned to Aspen Ridge not with a roar, but with a hush, with thawed earth underfoot and buds that opened cautiously, as though testing the world anew. Wild Haven stirred to life in the golden light of April mornings, its inhabitants shifting out of winter slumber and into movement, curiosity, and growth. The cubs who had come months earlier now bounded through their enclosure with lanky energy, chasing each other through puddles, their coats sleek and glistening under the sun. And beside them, moving slower but just as sure, was Shadow. He had grown into his presence, not just a figure within the sanctuary, but its quiet sentinel, the heart of its story. Visitors still came in steady numbers, drawn by the tale they had heard, the whispers of the bear who had survived the dark. But those who stayed long enough quickly understood that Shadow was not an exhibit. He was not a myth. He was a soul, alive and changing, and the truest part of the sanctuary's rhythm. Jack Morrison stood by the fence most days with a notebook in hand, logging behaviors, diet patterns, subtle shifts in posture or vocalization. But often he'd set the pen down and simply watch, a soft smile pulling at the corners of his mouth. He had built something here, not just a haven for animals, but a mirror for his own healing. Morrison Wildlife Recovery was no longer just a mobile unit. With help from a growing coalition of donors and volunteers, Jack and his team had broken ground on a permanent center just 20 miles east of Wild Haven. The site, nestled in a sheltered valley, would one day house temporary wildlife enclosures, a veterinary triage unit, and education facilities. But for now, it was a clearing marked by red flags and potential, and Jack visited often, running his hands over the cool metal of foundation frames, seeing in them a future still unfolding. Kyle had started interning full-time with Ed Parker, learning the deeper work of sanctuary operations, medicine, diet, behavioral enrichment. His bond with the animals had matured, and he carried a quiet authority now, one that surprised those who remembered the brooding teenager of just a year ago. In the evenings, he still brought his guitar out to the fields. Sometimes he'd play for the Cubs, sometimes he'd play for Shadow, and sometimes he'd just sit in the hush of twilight, strumming to the sky. Mia had been accepted into a state wildlife education program and was preparing to lead summer workshops for children across the region. Her afternoons were filled with planning games and lessons about habitat, empathy, and protection, all told through the lens of Shadow's story. Her smile, once shy, now shone with purpose. Emily, ever the pulse of the sanctuary's medical care, had taken on more responsibility too. She balanced her clinic work with training new volunteers, and though the days were long, they never wore her down. She moved with steadiness and resolve, her eyes always scanning, her mind always working. Yet when Jack met her gaze in the quiet moments, those rare pockets of stillness they carved for each other, he saw the softness there too, the shared understanding that they had come through something harrowing and had not just survived, but bloomed. Shadow's health had plateaued in the best way. He was strong now, muscle returned to his shoulders, his coat glossy. His eyes, once dim, now held a brightness that pierced. He had found his place in the sanctuary's social structure, not as a dominant male, but as a guide of sorts. The Cubs respected him, followed him, learned from him. And on occasion, Jack would see Shadow resting on a high outcrop, while the younger bears played below, watching them with a quiet vigilance that almost felt like pride. It was on one of those still mornings, the kind where mist clung to the grass and the sun rose slow and deliberate, that a new visitor arrived at Wild Haven. A girl named Lila, no more than 10 years old, small and soft-spoken, with a burned scar running down her left arm. She had come with her aunt, a counselor, who told Jack that Lila had been through a house fire, survived but quiet ever since. When she entered the sanctuary, she clung to her aunt's hand, eyes wide. Jack offered to guide her personally. As they walked, she said little. But when they reached Shadow's enclosure, she froze. Shadow was there, lounging near the stream. At the sight of them, he didn't move, didn't retreat. He only turned his head, blinked, and chuffed once, soft and low. Lila let go of her aunt's hand and walked forward slowly, stopping at the fence. For several minutes, she didn't speak. Then she whispered, almost too quiet to hear, "He was in the dark, too." Jack's throat tightened. "Yes," he said gently, "but he's in the light now." Lila nodded, "Like I'm trying to be." Her aunt wiped at her eyes. From that day on, Lila returned once a week. She'd sit quietly near the enclosure, reading aloud from a worn children's book, and Shadow would listen. Not always near, not always attentive, but present. And that was enough. That was everything. As spring unfurled fully and the wildflowers painted the edges of the sanctuary in bursts of yellow and purple, the team began preparing for a new project. A wildlife corridor that would allow some of the rehabilitated animals to roam across connected safe zones throughout the region. It was ambitious, but supported by landowners, environmental groups, and lawmakers who had been touched by the sanctuary's work. Jack, once wary of making promises he couldn't keep, now found himself planning years ahead, dreaming not in abstracts, but in action. On the anniversary of Morrison Wildlife Recovery's first mobile mission, they held a quiet ceremony under the big pine near the main lodge. No speeches, no press, just family. Those who had been there when the cage opened, when the first step was taken into the sun. Ed raised a toast with black coffee. "To the ones who walk through the dark and show us the way out." They all drank in silence. Shadow didn't attend, of course, but later that night, Jack stood at the edge of his enclosure. The bear was moving through the trees, slow and deliberate. Jack spoke softly, not expecting a reply. "You changed everything, you know. Not just this place. Us." Shadow paused, turned. In the moonlight, his eyes shone, not with pain, but with presence. Then he moved on, slipping back into the trees. Jack stayed a moment longer, listening to the rustle of branches, to the hush of wind, to the sound of life moving forward. That night, as Jack lay in bed beside Emily, her head tucked beneath his chin, he whispered, "I keep thinking this is the end of the story, but it never is." She smiled, eyes closed. Maybe it's not a story. Maybe it's a beginning that just keeps growing. Outside, the stars burned steady. The earth turned gently beneath them. And in the vastness of Montana's quiet night, the legacy of a bear, once known only as Shadow, became something greater. Not a tale of rescue, but a testament to the endurance of hope, to the courage it takes to heal, and to the truth that even from the deepest dark, light can rise. Not in a blaze, not in a roar, but in the steady, faithful steps of those who refuse to give up. And so it was that the final chapter was not an ending at all, but a continuation. A trail stretching beyond the trees, winding into the future. A bear no longer afraid, a man no longer broken, and a world that, because of them, had grown just a little kinder.